All right, tonight's speaker is Hazel Bohon, joining us again. Hazel is a software engineer and mom. With over a decade of experience working across a range of industries, she has a passion for solving problems and building reliable, scalable, maintainable systems. When she's not debugging code, you can find her down at the lake fishing with her kids. Please welcome Hazel Bohon.
Hello, let me just get this. Okay. Hello, today I will be speaking about .NET Aspire, recently rebranded just as Aspire, which is a cross-platform, now polyglot multi-language orchestration system that allows software engineers to write their orchestration code inside of an environment that's familiar, using the same coding languages that they use for actually writing and delivering business logic code. .NET Aspire works as gives you a series of templates, orchestration tools. It has integration packages for allowing you to build cloud resources and build cloud native applications. It has built-in observability using OpenTelemetry, which is one of those things that I find, at least, you always start the project and you never start really thinking about the observability question until you're almost in production, or even maybe until after you're already in production. And so it's really nice to have that built in as something at the very beginning of the process. And it provides a unified dashboard for logs and metrics, which we will get to in the live coding section of this. So how do we get started on with Aspire? I always like to go back to the command line whenever I'm working with a new tool. I don't know, it just, to me, always feels very comfortable. And one of the things that's really nice with Aspire is that you can get started in the very modern open source developer sort of way by piping a random URL into a bash command. So we can do this, go ahead and install Aspire. We need to reload our bash environment to add this to our path. And now we should be able to say Aspire version, see that's installed. So now we have the Aspire tool installed, which gives us a couple of different options. So we have, you can see here, we have the new command, which can be used to create new projects. You have run, which is used to actually run the app host. You have the ability to add additional integrations. You have this publish and deploy command. Both of these are sort of in preview at the moment, but we will get to those towards the end of it, sort of showing off what you can do with that and what's kind of in the future for the deployment portion of .NET Aspire or Aspire. So creating a new Aspire project is just as simple as Aspire new, and then you just need to pick a template to use. So we'll just use the starter template real quick. You can just call this demo. And then we just do that as the output path. We'll do that. Use Redis cache, why not? And then just create a test. We'll skip that for now. But nice to know that's something we can have. And then it's now created the project. So we can cd demo, open this up in VS Code. And so what we can see here, right, is we have this API service demo application, which is pretty straightforward. Should be familiar to a lot of C# developers, right? It's building a basic web application that presents a single API here, this /weather forecast. And then we have down here a Razor page, which has the ability to pull from that API and also has all of the different components for your standard Razor page stuff. Nothing too revolutionary there, nothing too unusual or unexpected. The two new projects that are added in here is we have this app host, which contains the apphost.cs file and the service defaults. So the service defaults contains some extension methods that help you to just sort of define the different ways in which services will be interacted with. It's generally not something that you necessarily need to code. It kind of comes with a basic set of the things that you'll need. The app host file is where we're going to define how we actually want to do all of our orchestration. So you can see here, we create this builder object from the distributed application.createBuilder. And then we build a Redis cache here. So we're just adding Redis cache. And then we are adding this project down here as API service. And then we can add that to the web demo right here as a reference so that it knows where to find that. And so you can see we have all the different things added here. We also have this reference to back to this cache that's been created. And so we've created the entire application, orchestrated how all the different pieces are going to connect together. And you'll notice there's no connection strings or other information for like that related to the Redis cache here. Adding Redis is just as easy as this one line, and then just passing that in as a reference to our backend, or yeah, to our front end. And so then how do we run this? Well, we can get right back to the command line and we can just go Aspire run. And that will go ahead and go through the process of building, setting up everything, and it creates this dashboard, which we can then open up here. So here you can see all of the different resources that we have running. So you can see we have this cache. We have a Redis cache here that's running. We have our 2 services. You can go ahead and click through and see the Hello World Welcome API front end application. You can pull from the weather. It can use this counter that's just like runs completely in the front end, but then this weather API is pulling from our back end in order to do that.
Yeah, thank you. It's
And let me see. You can also, if you wanted to look in Docker, you should be able to see right there, there's our cache, our Redis cache running locally in our Docker environment. And if you want to turn that all back off, it's just as easy as pressing Control C, and then it will go ahead and shut down the other things. There we go. And we'll go ahead and shut down all the resources so you can spin up an entire developer environment, break down an entire developer environment relatively easily. So that's the basic anatomy of doing work with Aspire. We can look at a more advanced or more robust project with a little bit more detail to it, because this one is very minimal. So here we have a in-service bus sample application. And so in this one, once again, we have the app host with its app host.cs file that defines all of the orchestration for everything. This example is slightly more complicated, like I said, and it includes it includes a transport, which is used for passing messages between the different services. In this case, we've got RabbitMQ. And as you can see, we have the management plugin set up for RabbitMQ using this port. We have a management URL, but we're not defining a username or a password, which is one of the things that I think is really interesting that you get to do when you're working with this, because what will happen is this Rabbit builder, the add RabbitMQ builder command, will go ahead and automatically create that for you. It will create a default username and a default password sort of randomly generated so that you don't have to worry about sort of setting up like a developer environment version of that thing. And not only that, then we have this reference. So we can come in here and we can say with environment connection string and pass that into like the various service control audit systems. So that way, again, this automatically generated thing, this automatically generated connection string that comes from the username and password that were generated as part of RabbitMQ setup up here are automatically propagated into each of these different containers. So you can see here, we're just adding container, and a lot of these commands in here will be very familiar from sort of doing your Docker setups, right? It's the same sort of commands, but just all inside of a C# environment. So we can come here where we did that, and we can go Aspire. Actually, let me show you. We can also, if you have the plugins, the Aspire plugin and everything set up inside of the ES code, you can just click this Run Aspire, and then it will do the same sort of thing. And then even opening the page. Oop. Strange doing this too. It's the one I want to log into. There. Okay. So we can see here that this one's spinning up quite a few more resources as we're going through this. So you can see here that we have a Postgres database that has been spun up. We have a PG admin user for that. We have a shipping DB database that's been added. We have service control, which is a service that particular software makes for in-service bus, which helps to monitor message queues and gives information. We have the service control audit, service control monitoring. These are also related to that. Service control RavenDB is a RavenDB database that's used for doing document storage of the information that's collected as part of Service Pulse, or in order to provide Service Pulse with all of what it needs to run. As you can see here, we have Service Pulse. You can click through, you can see Service Pulse, and all of this has been set up automatically as part of Aspire, booting up all of these different systems. And we have here a billing and a sales and a shipping separate systems that can be used. You can also go in and look at like RabbitMQ's management interface. Oh, that's fine. There we go. You can get into RabbitMQ, except that we don't know the password, right? But you can see here, when you go to the RabbitMQ instance, you can click here, view details, and then we can see all of the different environment variables, including the username and password. So like I said earlier, this has been a randomly generated password, right? Should be able to come in here. I believe this one will work. Yeah, and so yeah, we can get into the RabbitMQ container. We can see all of the front end stuff for that as well. And so we've got all the different parts of this available to us together here. And yeah, and all of it's spun up. And oh, the thing that I was really wanting to show you here, right, is if you look here at this service control instance, let me look at the details for this one. You can see here that that environment variable that we'd set up earlier has been correctly the connection string environment variable has been propagated with this AMQP guest, right? All of this information. And we look back here in the code. And all we had to do was add this with environment variable connection string and then pass in the transport object here. So what happens is when you call this add build, this right here, what it's returning is a iResource builder instance. And then that provides APIs information so that, for example, when you go here and you make a reference to it with environment, it knows that this is one that creates a connection string. And so it will return back the connection string to populate this information. And so in that way, you're able to orchestrate everything. You're able to pass information back through the different containers and structure all of your orchestration in a way that, like I said, is very followable. It's very comprehensible to you as the front end user or as the developer. So let's see. So not everyone gets to have the Aspire new process, though. Many folks have existing projects that they might be interested in migrating over to this system. So there's different migration tools which are available. You can add your existing C# projects into Aspire app host in the same way. Let's see. You can add them into you can add Aspire app host into an existing project. You can also migrate Docker Compose over to Aspire. They have guides on the webpage showing all of the different things that you might find in a Docker Compose file and how you can transform those concepts into Aspire concepts. And then you can also bring in your existing Docker files. You can do a with Docker file in order to grab a Docker file and compose that. And you can do a similar thing in order to pull in the various pieces from other sources that you may have. So you can use this as a way of combining together additional outside resources and creating complex orchestration environments. All right, and so moving on to the deployment story. So this is something that very much is still an in progress and underway development, but I think it has a lot of interesting potential. So right now, one of the things that you can do is you can use the aspire publish command that I referenced earlier, and we have different supported targets for that. So there's a Docker one, which can compose into Docker or Docker. It can do Docker compose or Docker files. There's a Kubernetes one. There's an Azure Container Apps one. There's ones for Azure App Services. There's many different versions of this that are available, and you can add them as these different packages listed here. So real quick, I can show off that. So right now, for this project, right, if we were to go aspire publish, we get an error because we don't have an actual publishing target set. So let's go ahead and add the Docker target real quick. So in order to do that, all you really have to do is you can come in, do a .NET add, and then you're adding aspire.hosting.docker. So it's in preview, so you kind of have to specify this preview version of it. Sorry, you need to be in the app host directory in order to make that work. So I go to app host, and then that should work. Okay, fantastic. So now that's installed. And so we can come here into our orchestration file, right? We've got the builder, so we can just go builder dot add Docker compose environment. And we just call it compose. Go ahead and save that. And now we can go back to the command line. There we go. Awesome. And so now we should be able to come over here and see this Aspire output. And so here you can see we have the different environment variables, these parameters that will need to be filled in order to, yeah. And you also have a Docker compose file with a huge amount of just specification of all the different aspects of this, including it even goes ahead and wraps that like really cool Aspire dashboard right into your deployment environment for this, so that if that's something that you had gotten used to in your development environment, it's something that can also be pushed forward. That was a feature that they added in a relatively recent version of it, something that a lot of folks who've been using it were really excited about, and so they've gone ahead and added that into like deployable environments. So similarly, if we wanted to add Kubernetes instead, we can just go ahead and add for the Kubernetes package, which that's just aspire.hosting.kubernetes. And then I'm just going to go ahead and remove the existing Aspire output stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead and do .aspire publish again. And now you see here we have, oh, sorry, I forgot to update this part here. Package is installed, but it still has that as the target. Let's get rid of that. Let's replace that with builder.add Kubernetes environment. Now, clear away that stuff, and we do the publish again. And you can see here, now we've got a chart. We've got all the different values for everything. We've got a bunch of templates for everything. It looks like we have done a ton of work. And all without having to actually hand edit these YAML files. You can see here that we have certain spots where they have these. Yes. And so then, yeah, so this then allows you to build this into your CI/CD pipelines because you can add those files in, and whatever current deployment system you have, or using Kubernetes or for using Docker Compose, you can check that in. You can have infrastructure as code where the changes are all defined by changes in your Docker Compose or in your Kubernetes YAML files, which allows you to have auditable deterministic changes in your infrastructure, and gives total flexibility as far as the different ways that things can be deployed. And one of the things that I think is a really neat additional feature here, right? So let's say that we actually had both of these turned on, right? And now we go to generate our output, right? To generate our published. This time, I think, yes, we're going to get an error because we need to actually specify where each one of these goes. And so we can change that by going with adding this with compute environment. And then we can need to specify dates, right? And so we would add that for each one of these. And so we could add, and so you can make it the case that if you have a complex deployment environment in which you have, maybe you need to have a Docker Compose file for some of your things, and you need to have a Kubernetes file for some of your things, and other things need to be sent to through bicep files into another area. You have the ability to compose all of that and then associate them to the specific compute environments here as part of the publish, but then that doesn't get in the way of when you're actually building the application in your local development environment. So even though you may have a multi-cloud deployment scenario, your local development experience is still extremely, is still svelte and unified. And so, yeah, that's my introduction to Docker, or to Aspire. And so, yeah, if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Hazel. Hey, I got a question. When you were adding those two lines for Docker and the other one for Kubernetes, are those just for publishing, or are those required at runtime as well?
So in the case where you're using these, what you would be doing, right, is you're generating that. The idea is that you would use this in order to generate the Docker Compose file, and then you use the Docker Compose file to actually do your production deployments. And so that way, if the folks in DevOps aren't as comfortable with your C# code, you can deliver to them either like Kubernetes files or Docker Compose files that they can audit and do their own code reviews on to make sure that everything looks reasonable as far as like the deployment process is concerned. So it's not necessary for like running. It's not actually necessary for deployment necessary, right? Because you also have the there's also a deploy option, which will deploy directly into cloud infrastructure without having the intermediate step of generating the files.
Okay.
But personally, I very much prefer to have the files generated like that, so that you have that like clearer audit trail of the changes to infrastructure.
We do have a
There-
question from the chat,
Yeah.
from Maxim. How is different Aspire deployment model from Pulumi or Terraform?
So you can actually generate Terraform files from this, and you can actually incorporate Terraform files in if that's something you already have. For example, I'm not as familiar with Pulumi. I would say the biggest difference between this and Terraform is that my frustration with Terraform has always been that when I'm working through Terraform, if we get into a place in which the Terraform defined YAML doesn't quite meet the exact needs of the scenario that we have, we have to like drop down into Bash or some other coding environment, right? So I think one of the real strengths of Aspire is that you get to write all of this orchestration code inside of C# or inside of Python or any number of other languages that they've recently introduced. And that means that you have that ability to drop into arbitrary levels of complexity to like reference outside sources, to do inheritance if you need to do inheritance, right? To isolate concepts into functionality that can then be turned into a function and can be repeatedly applied in different locations. And so it just gives you a lot more of that higher level software engineering, like developer toolkit for designing everything and laying everything out. Whereas the philosophy of stuff like Terraform is very much against that, right? Like it doesn't want to keep things dry. It wants very much that you explicitly are laying out each of the different steps of the process. Each of the different resources has its own separate definitions. And I definitely understand the value of that for Terraform, but I think as a developer, I'm much more drawn to this and having the ability to have this then output those things for me instead of having to manage them directly like that. Also, I just do not like YAML files. I don't know, it's a personal aversion I have.
So why do you think that they produced this or released this with a CLI? What didn't it have before in the Visual Studio template?
I think it's had the CLI pretty much since early on in its development lifecycle. Yeah, I think they've had that, right? Because like it's been a .NET.
Oh, I haven't used it, so I don't know. Okay, maybe.
Yeah, the original idea behind developing it was that it came out of essentially just like Microsoft engineers sort of scratching their own internal itch, right? As far as like their development environment and being able to set things up and break things down, and a series of tools that have been developed internally. And then, yeah, and then they pitched it internally inside Microsoft, and it got a lot of like traction. And so they started releasing it, and it's been moving extremely fast because it's only been out for I think 2 years at this point, right? But it's already at version 9.5.2 is the current version of it, and they're doing releases on a constant basis. They have new features coming out all the time, and like I was saying, this one that we're talking about here, the deployment stuff, is still in preview. It's still like an early feature that they're still working out everything on, because this is sort of one of the challenges that they had early on was that it was a really cool developer environment, but then it didn't necessarily have as compelling of a deployment process, right? Because they just had a deploy that would deploy it onto a cloud, but that's not really a realistic scenario for how most engineering organizations are actually doing their deployments, right? They're typically focusing a lot more on having a CI/CD pipeline, something like that that you can tie into. And so they've been exploring different ways to integrate the Aspire developer environment more smoothly into the CI/CD pipelines. And so I think that's a big thing that we're getting now with the ability to do these publish things where you're creating those more deterministic like Docker Compose or Kubernetes files that can then go through a normal established CI/CD pipeline. And they also have some additional tools that allow us to do that. Yeah, I agree with Nick. I've spent a lot of years working outside of the .NET environment, and so the CLI tools are definitely a much more comfortable space for me. And being able to do that always makes me feel like I have a much better understanding of what's going on with any given like tool or application, right? Like I absolutely love that I can go wish Aspire and see like where it's located on my system, right? And just have that level of understanding, even though like I can't imagine a scenario or a likely scenario where that's going to come up very much outside of, my old days of like doing Python development where you'd often have the wrong version of Python running in your shell or something like that, right? So yeah, it's a good tool and I enjoy it a lot.
We did have a question from Chris Harrington. First of all, Chris notes, and I agree, this is really cool. Does this have support for, say, pivoting to managed resources like an AWS RDS database on deployment versus a Docker deployed resource during development?
Yeah, so there's actually a huge number of Aspire. Let me see. Yes, there's a huge number of integrations for Aspire that are out there. They've got a lot of, let's say AWS. So you got hosting AWS integration that exists. Let's see, what all does it have inside of it? Package. Yeah, and so it has database configs. You can set up SQS. I'm sorry. Yeah, so there's a huge number of these and people are writing more all the time.
Oh, thank you. Other questions?
And then yeah, let me put this in chat because I think that the list of all the different integrations available is really cool.
Awesome. And for those of you who are watching this on our YouTube channel, look below in the description. We'll have that link in the description of this YouTube video as well.